In order to minimize bias in a surgical randomized controlled trial, a process known as blinding is often utilized. The term blinding refers to the concealment of treatment allocation from individuals involved in the study. Many different individuals can be blinded, such as the personnel involved in delivering the intervention, patients participating in the study, outcome assessors, and data analysts. This video will focus on the blinding of patients. The main reason for blinding patients in a randomized controlled trial is to reduce bias, which can occur in two different ways. Outcome reporting bias, or ascertainment bias, refers to systematic differences in the assessment of outcomes between groups. It can occur if the person measuring the outcome knows which intervention the patient has received, and this influences them, either consciously or unconsciously. Most outcomes, such as clinical adverse events, are measured by an observer, such as a research nurse. For these outcomes, the observer would need to be blinded to reduce outcome reporting bias. Patient-reported outcomes are reported directly by the patients themselves, such as health-related quality of life or physical function. For these outcomes, the patient would need to be blinded to reduce bias. This is especially important when assessing subjective outcomes such as pain. Performance bias relates to systematic differences in the delivery of interventions or co-interventions in a trial. Whilst it is usually clinicians that deliver the interventions and co-interventions in a surgical trial, the delivery of some co-interventions, such as analgesia, the relief of pain, can be affected by a patient's knowledge of their treatment allocation. For example, someone who knows that they have had an open procedure may request more or stronger painkillers than someone who has had a keyhole procedure. The Romeo study provides a good example of blinding patients to their procedural allocation during a randomized controlled surgical trial. The study aims to compare open surgery involving a large incision and keyhole surgery or minimally invasive surgery involving several smaller incisions in patients with esophageal cancer. The main reason for blinding patients in the Romeo study is because of two important patient-reported assessments of pain and quality of life. As these are subjective measures rather than objective, and reported by the patients rather than observers, it was considered vital to undertake these assessments whilst the patients remained blinded to their procedural allocation. This is because their self-assessment of pain could easily be influenced by knowing which operation they had received.
So, for example, if the patient knows they've had open surgery, they might expect to be in more pain, or if they've had keyhole surgery, they might expect to be in less pain.
Those who meet the eligibility criteria and consent are randomized to either an open procedure involving a large incision or keyhole with several smaller incisions. After the surgery, patient's data is collected, including a health-related quality of life questionnaire carried out on day 6 post-surgery. Patients are also asked to complete a pain score at day 3 and day 6 post-surgery. Finally, on day 6, after these initial subjective assessments have been undertaken, the patients were told their procedural allocation. In order to blind patients to their allocated procedure, all dressings applied in theatre were the same. Patients who had undergone open surgery were given a large dressing to cover the wound, as well as several smaller dressings to cover the skin where incisions would be had they have had keyhole surgery. Those who received keyhole surgery would be given smaller dressings to cover the incisions, as well as a big dressing to cover where the larger wound would be had they have had open surgery. After the quality of life questionnaires and pain scores had been completed, on day 6 post-surgery, the patient can be unblinded.
Ideally, the person using the bang blinding index should not know the patient's approach to the surgery. We read out the approaches just to remind them and ask the patient to guess.
I couldn't tell from the bandages and plasters and things that I had on. Nothing gave me any, all I had was the way I felt. And that was how I judged it. And I was completely wrong.
Some get it right and some get it wrong. And some are convinced they've got it right and they still get it wrong.
These preliminary results reflect the success of the blinding process. At 3 days, 51% of patients correctly guessed their allocated procedure, with a small increase by 6 days to 57%. At 3 days, 39% of patients incorrectly guessed their allocated procedure, with a small decrease at 6 days to 38%. At 3 days, 10% of patients didn't know and were unable to make a guess. This decreased to 5% at 6 days.
So when we first started Romeo, I used to go up to pre-op in the morning and talk to the anaesthetist about it and talk to the physio about it, and anybody really who was going to talk to the patient had to be aware that the patient didn't know their approach. And we've been doing Romeo for a while now, and everyone's on board. The ward staff, anybody who speaks to the patient or has any interaction with the patient knows that the patient has had an esophagectomy but doesn't know their approach, and it's worked very well.